Oxford Languages defines plagiarism as the practice of taking someone else's work or ideas and passing them off as one's own. So, yes? The original studio and director of How to Train Your Dragon directed the new one. Oh, so no then. I guess that answers that question. However, you can still plagiarize your own work, as Oxford and Merriam-Webster also define plagiarism as reusing your own work or presenting an existing source as if it was new and original. This is going to be complicated, isn't it? Fine. Roll the intro. Hello there, and welcome back to the channel. So, could the live action How to Train Your Dragon arguably be considered plagiarism? Well, as you all saw at the beginning of this video, it's kind of hard to say. What exactly merits true plagiarism gets a bit muddy when dealing with things like live action remakes, especially when you have the original director returning. And for the sake of this video, I'm talking more from a creative perspective, not a corporate one. Meaning that, yes, obviously DreamWorks has every legal right to create a remake because they own the property. I'm simply talking about if this is creatively plagiarizing the original directors and artistic team. But first off, we need to clear the air a bit. If you've been following me for a while, you'll know I absolutely detest these live action remakes. However, I've never brought up this question of plagiarism before. Why is that? Well, most of Disney's remakes have their fair share of problems. There are changes to the source material. Not good ones, mind you, but on some level you could claim there was a reason to adapt these films. As much as I hate the new Snow White, trying to update the original story is a valid enough reason to retell it. Even if it's a bad reason or a trash execution, it is still a reason. However, this is not the case for the How to Train Your Dragon remake. Now, to be fully transparent, I have not seen this new one, and that's because I have a philosophical problem with these remakes. However, from all the reviews I've seen, and I've seen quite a few, they all suggest the movie is basically a shot-for-shot remake of the animated film. The only real downgrade was how Astrid and Hiccup's relationship was developed. But even if it was done just like in the original, this perfectly demonstrates the paradox of live-action remakes. If you make zero changes to the original story, then what in the world was the point in remaking it? Outside of earning easy money, the film is pointless because you already have the same story told with so much more life and color to it. However, making too many changes, especially unnecessary ones, runs the risk of disrespecting the original film and ruining its legacy. Now, I've already made a video discussing how remaking a story is possible, even How to Train Your Dragon. I highly recommend you watch that afterwards to get a better understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of animation versus live action. But retelling a classic story well requires a lot of work, and as of yet, I have not seen a mainstream remake that's actually done that, at least in the last 10 years. Now, I've seen quite a few people say the How to Train Your Dragon remake was actually pretty good and possibly the best of these live action remakes. Okay, but why was it good? Because if it really is a shot-for-shot remake of the original, then obviously it's going to be good. The 2010 film is regarded as one of the best animated films of all time, and it's for a reason. It's a heartfelt story, the dragons are cool, the action and animation are amazing. Making a copy of that will inevitably be good. If I took a Krabby Patty, put some red food dye and resold them as a pretty patty, yeah, obviously it's going to be great because it's still fundamentally a Krabby Patty. If I took A New Hope, renamed it to The Force Awakens, and put it out in theaters, yeah, it's going to be praised because A New Hope is one of the most revolutionary films of all time. But this is where we go back to the plagiarism debate. Oh, and for the record, I don't think I can say with full certainty Force Awakens plagiarizes A New Hope. Finn's story does introduce new concepts, and some of the other plot devices are different enough as not to be a complete copy of A New Hope. But I'm getting sidetracked here. All of this is to say, can we really consider the remake of How to Train Your Dragon a good movie if almost everything about it is a direct copy of the original? I mean, most of the cinematography and the dialogue and the music is ripped straight from the 2010 film. I mean, that sounds like plagiarism to me. Sure, on a technical level it might be good, but by being a carbon copy and offering nothing new, it ultimately becomes a bad product because its sole purpose is to piggyback off a big brand and to prey on the wallets from fans of the original. Of course, some of you might argue, well, there actually are changes made, so it isn't exactly like the original. And to that, I would ask, do any of those changes matter? Oxford points out that rewriting a few words, reshaping grammar, or even paraphrasing can be considered plagiarism because you're not actually adding new ideas, nor are you crediting the work of the original author. Here's an example. Let's say I take The Great Gatsby and rename it The New Gatsby. I copy and paste 85% of the original novel while grammatically reshaping the other 15%. Then, instead of all the text being black, I take a random number generator and make each paragraph a different color and perhaps a different font. Is this plagiarism? Absolutely. Because the book is practically the exact same as Fitzgerald's original work with very unimportant and superficial changes. The skin or the packaging might look a bit different, but it's still The Great Gatsby and it's not a new product. Likewise, adding a few lines of dialogue, shifting some scenes or shots through editing, or changing the tune of the soundtrack are extremely surface level changes that don't actually transform this movie into a new product. If this remake were made by any other company, you can bet DreamWorks would sue them into oblivion for infringing on their copyright. And they'd have every right to do so. I'd be more okay with this if they added scenes that truly recontextualize the story or added some new elements that make this version different from the animation. But from what I can tell, there's really none of that. Here's the thing though. There are two things that might save this movie from the allegations. First, the original director came back to film the live action remake. He specifically asked to lead this project because he didn't want anyone else ruining the story. And honestly, I completely get that. However, this alone doesn't rescue something from plagiarism. When most of us think of the term plagiarism, we think of the Great Gatsby example I gave where you're literally copying someone else's work and claiming it as your own. However, you can still plagiarize your own work. I'm sure all of you who went to college were told this one point or another. Those essays still give me nightmares.
Why isn't it possible?
It's just not.
Why not, you stupid bastard?
Anyways, the reason self-plagiarism is bad isn't because it infringes on the author's rights. After all, they're the ones who own it. The reason has to do with false advertising. Let's say F. Scott Fitzgerald did the same thing from earlier and retitled his book The New Gatsby. He then proceeds to sell it with the notion you're going to have a different or entirely new experience reading it. This is false advertisement because there's nothing inherently original about the new work. You've essentially told your audience you're paying for a new product and that it is worth your money. But of course, this is a lie because it is a purely recycled copy. The changes are so minor, they might as well be considered the original product. This would be like advertising a new flavor of Coke, but the only changes are its color and maybe the calorie count is slightly altered. So by those standards, one could argue the new How to Train Your Dragon is plagiarism. But again, the original director is okaying the work. Like, he's literally leading it. So I can understand why this alone would bar the remake from being considered plagiarism. But the second point is far more important. It's pretty obvious this is a copy. Like, what is everyone calling this? A remake. Or some in the marketing might call it a reimagining. The film acknowledges the existence of the original, and even in the promotional material, the director talked about honoring the 2010 film and its fans, going so far as to say he didn't want anyone else's version of the story. So in this way, you could argue the remake is not plagiarism because it's citing its source and making it obvious this is not an original work. However, this starts to fall apart pretty quickly when we talk about copyright law. Which, I know, I said this wasn't going to be talking about the corporate side, but I do have to bring up this point. Nintendo is probably the biggest example of this. We've seen how strict they can be when abusing this law. Most of us would probably consider Palworld a parody at best, but Nintendo thought the mere concept of catching animals in a ball infringed on their copyright. And we've seen countless times how creators will attribute Nintendo when making fan art, yet their work will be deleted without a thought, and even their livelihoods might be at risk due to Nintendo's ninjas. Now, personally, I consider this an abuse of power. I mean, I don't really see how making some cool fan art or mods hurts Nintendo's bottom line. But for the less invasive stuff, it is within the company's legal right to take down these projects. And like I stated earlier, if the How to Train Your Dragon remake were made by any other entity, even if they promoted the fact it wasn't an original film, DreamWorks and Universal would probably sue them, because they would be profiting from a big name brand, and in that case it would be considered copyright infringement because DreamWorks lost out on millions and millions of dollars, and I'm sure they would not be happy with that. So this all goes back to the main question. Is the How to Train Your Dragon remake plagiarism? Well, the answer probably depends on how loose your definition of plagiarism is, but personally, I kind of lean towards yes. The whole push for these remakes is to experience these animated films in a new way. Whether it's to add realism or to ground these characters or expand on the themes from the original, heck, even to quote unquote fix the problems from the originals, there's a push to see this story in a new way. Otherwise, why don't you just re-release the movie in theaters or tell people to watch it on streaming? If we're taking the textbook definition of plagiarism, I do think there's an argument that this remake falls under that. But at the very least, even if this isn't plagiarism, the film is extremely scummy. Not only does this new film not add anything to the original story, but it's solely there to bank off nostalgia, and it continues to downplay animation as a medium. At least the Lilo and Stitch remake or the 2025 Snow White tried to be different than the original. Even if the execution was terrible or like actually trash, at least there was some creative output because the creators wanted to fix what they saw as flaws from the original. But the new How to Train Your Dragon is just pointless. There's no creativity here. There's no new or interesting directions the story goes. It's just a corporate and worse looking husk of the original, built solely for profit and to prey off families. And I can't even blame the director or the actors. The blame is on DreamWorks and Universal. All the millions of dollars wasted on this project could have gone to a filmmaker with a real passion for telling stories. There's someone out there who's waiting to make a project that moves people on a deeply emotional level. Someone who wants to make a positive impact on the industry and the world. But instead, all this money is wasted on a bland remake, a soulless cash grab which robs creators and audiences of an amazing story. But what do you think about this? Is the new How to Train Your Dragon plagiarism? There's no right or wrong answer here. I mean, I feel like the definition of plagiarism gets a bit loose in this situation, so I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on all this. Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.